So after talking about Aristotle's ethic, you're probably thinking, well, this is all well and good. I know how to become a moral person, but how do I know whether an action is morally good or morally evil? Because that's the thing that we really want to know, right? How can we tell whether an action is praiseworthy or blameworthy? There are a lot of philosophical systems that help us to do this, and the two that we're going to look at focus on two ends of the action. One is the intent of the action. What is your intent going into the action? Why do you want to do it? What's the reasoning behind it? The other is the consequence of the action. What happens because of the action? An intention-based ethic is called a deontological ethic. Deontological, that word comes from the word duty, and says that you really ought to evaluate an action based upon the duty, the obligation, that created that action. The other form is a consequentialist ethic. It says that you ought to evaluate an action based on the consequences of the action. So let's look at deontological ethics here. Deontological ethics, probably the foremost proponent of deontological ethics was the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant lived during the 18th century in what is now Poland. He lived in Prussia at the time. And Kant wrote a lot of books. He wrote a lot about morality and reason and metaphysics and things like that. Kant's big idea in morality is something called the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is a law that's written upon the minds of every human being. And Kant says that this law is something that we can get to through the use of pure reason. And he says that this moral law will help us to evaluate our intentions, because the only thing we can truly control is our own goodwill. Kant says that there are two forms of the categorical imperative. The first form of the categorical imperative is universalizability. When you're thinking about an action, can you take the action that you're about to perform and turn it into a universal law? Basically, can you will that every other human being on earth can do this? If you can't, then your action is morally wrong. So, if I can't say that the action that I'm about to do is something everyone could do, then I'm probably doing something wrong. Give you an example. If I go into Walmart and I see a CD on the shelf and I start thinking about me as a teacher, and that Walmart's a big corporation, they're not going to miss that one CD on the shelf, and I should just be able to take that CD off, put it in my bag, and go home, I may be able to justify it to myself, to talk myself into it. But you'll notice that I'm making a whole lot of special exemptions for myself. So what Kant says I need to do is I need to say, is the rule that I'm about to follow, that stealing from a multinational corporation is okay, something that everyone ought to do, or that everyone ought to be able to follow? And if I can't universalize it, then I'm probably doing something wrong. And so if you think about it, if I universalize that rule that stealing is okay, then basically we have a world where private property doesn't exist, where there's no right to property at all, and where our entire economy collapses. And in essence, this is a world that would not be a great place to live. So according to the rule of universalizability, doing that is wrong. Now the next rule that Kant gives us is the means-ends rule. He says that for every action that you do, you need to treat people as ends in themselves rather than as means to an end. Basically, don't use another person to get something that you want. Treat another person as a person. That every human being has human rights and ought to be treated as a real human person rather than as an object to get something you desire. In this, Kant's idea is very similar to the ideas of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. Martin Buber says that you ought to treat other people as thous, as full people, rather than as its, as objects to use to get something you desire. And I think if you think about a lot of issues in ethics, the places where we find ourselves doing something immoral is where we take another human being and we treat that person as an object to get something that we want. And so according to Kant, you need to treat a person as an end rather than as a means to an end. So these are the two forms of Kant's categorical imperative. A person should act that the principle of one's act could become a universal law of human action in a world in which one would hope to live, and that a person should treat other people as having intrinsic value and not merely as a means to achieve one's end. This is how you figure out whether you have a good intent and whether your action is morally correct.